It was Halloween and the flight had suffered a huge delay for whatever reason, which led to most of the passengers being reseated on other flights, leaving only a handful of us, and by us, I mean those unlucky enough not to have been reseated or unable to afford a hotel, stuck at the airport. Despite the long wait, I actually preferred sharing the cabin with fewer passengers, which is something usually one could only accomplish in first class. I enjoyed the luxury of being able to choose my seat once I boarded the flight. While most of the passengers had decided to sit at the far back section of the plane, I chose a quiet corner seat in the front section where there were just a few other passengers that appeared to know each other judging by how close they were seated together. The flight was originally intended to take place during the day, but the delay had resulted in an overnight flight. Not a big deal, but I did miss seeing the awesome view from outside the window, which eventually led me to focus my attention to the interior of the cabin. Despite the fact that most planes often appear larger on the inside, the enclosed space always made me feel a little uncomfortable, and usually resulted in a persistent need for a distraction such as reading a book or listening to music. I was about to pull out my phone when I was suddenly approached by the flight attendant asking me if I wouldn't mind sitting with the other passengers. Albeit confused, I agreed to the unusual request, since I was travelling fairly light and I figured there must have been a good reason for it, although I did regret asking why when I had the chance. Shortly after changing seats and settling in, the entire cabin plunged into an eerie silence. I probably wouldn't have thought that much of it had it not been for the conversations between the other passengers that had quickly faded into frightened whispers of shock and disbelief. Have you ever felt that strange sensation of the atmosphere around you instantly becoming heavy with sorrow and the thought of never being cheerful again? That's exactly what it felt like, and even more so as I looked to see what everyone was getting so upset about. I couldn't quite believe my eyes at first, and the notion of sharing a small cabin with a dead person for the remainder of the flight was extremely unsettling. I knew that the flight staff were probably just following procedure, but I could still feel my stomach churning in the face of this morbid turn of events. At that point, I decided to head on to the restroom. I eventually ended up just taking a breather and telling myself to get a grip. I wasn't the only passenger on the plane after all. After a few minutes of finally pulling myself together enough to try to get through the rest of the flight, a loud thud shook the door. Suddenly, the banging stopped and all I could hear was my elevated breathing. Strangely, I felt less safe alone locked inside the restroom than I did outside with the rest of the passengers, so I waited just a few minutes before cautiously opening the door. I couldn't see any sign of danger as I peered through the gap in the door and prepared to vacate the restroom. Just as I was about to discreetly return to my seat, the same flight attendant from before appeared out of nowhere, almost hitting me with the service trolley. It looked like she had just finished serving fresh beverages to some of the passengers, and I remember thinking how strange it was that she appeared oblivious to the loud banging on the restroom door that had occurred just moments prior. She remained completely speechless, and there was something off about the way she looked at me. You know that weird stare you give someone when you suspect that they're onto you for whatever reason? I eventually broke eye contact, and she continued down the aisle to serve drinks to the rest of the passengers. I quickly returned to my seat, having almost completely forgotten about the corpse that had been seated in the corner behind me. I still can't believe I managed to walk right past it without even noticing. I guess I was still a little distracted by the fact that none of the other passengers appeared to have heard the loud banging on the door either. Perhaps it wasn't as loud as I remember, or maybe it was just a prank. It was Halloween after all. At least I had a spooky Halloween tale to share with my young nephews back at home, even if it meant not being able to share the entire truth of what really happened on board that flight. At least until now. So this is a creepy story that I don't usually talk about. It happened to me quite a while ago, so I probably won't remember all of the details, but I will never forget the strange experience that took place at a nearby subway station, which drove a sinister wedge between me, my friends, and my family. I was around 22 years of age at the time, and I had just started taking music lessons in the evenings. I was at a stage where I was still trying to figure things out and get used to life in the big city. I remember that the lessons finished a lot later than usual that day for some reason, so it was already well past 11 at night by the time I got to the subway after grabbing a bite to eat, which meant that the circulation of trains was few and far between. As I anxiously waited for the signature sound of a distant train, I observed the platform and was surprised to see how abandoned it was. I had taken the subway at unsocial hours before, but I had never seen it as empty as it was that night. It was very quiet and there was no one else around. At least that's what I thought, until I noticed someone standing behind one of the columns near the edge of the platform. I leaned forward to get a better look, but it almost felt like the stranger was intentionally trying to avoid being seen, so I just looked straight ahead and minded my own business. But the silence didn't last long after that. Suddenly I could hear the sound of someone whistling. It appeared to come from all directions, and there was something about it that made me feel uneasy, but luckily it was soon overshadowed by the sound of a train fast approaching. As I prepared to embark on the train, I was surprised to see a well-dressed man step out from behind a column and walk to the edge of the platform. I felt relieved to see that it wasn't some thug or potential troublemaker, yet still, something was strangely off about him and he seemed somewhat gaunt. It always made me feel a little nervous to see someone standing so close to the edge of the platform, even when it was a stranger, but I suspected he was just as anxious to get to his destination as I was. Midnight was close upon us, after all. He stood there, very still, and hadn't acknowledged my presence whatsoever until he slowly started turning his head towards me. With eyes wide open, he greeted me with a creepy grin and an unsettling stare. I made a conscious effort to ignore him staring at me like that, but then he employed a sinister laugh that gave me a persistent chill, which was then followed by something that still horrifies me to this day. As he fell directly into the path of the arriving train, I rushed to try to save him, but it was too late. It took me a few seconds to grasp what I had just seen, and I was still in shock when I hurried to the nearest ticket booth to get help, which resulted in an entire shutdown of the subway. The subway employees inspected both the track and the train, but they didn't find any evidence of a body or even a single drop of blood. After checking the tunnels, their attention shifted to me and the tone of the whole situation took a drastic turn for the worse. I implored them to check the cameras to prove that I wasn't lying, but when they reviewed the footage, there was no sign of the man, just me running towards an oncoming train. They told my parents what happened, and rumors spread very quickly after that. As a devoted Catholic, my mother never looked at me the same way again, and my father just put on a brave face. When that happened, the truth didn't really matter that much anymore, and life sort of carried on without ever really going back to normal. I left home the same year and moved into a shabby old apartment downtown. Needless to say, commuting around the city never felt quite the same after that, and I still find myself staring at the ceiling every night, contemplating the truth about what I witnessed that fateful day at the subway.